I'll be honest with you. I heard a knock on my door in the middle of the night. I wasn't shocked it was my brother, but he had been acting strangely recently. Something about the way he stared at me made me feel like I was a prayer he wanted to eat. What made it extra stranger was that I wanted to be eaten by him as well. It was dark and peaceful. But I could hear my heart beat as he sat by my bed. But when he leaned closer, my heart stopped. Are we really doing this? So what was it about my brother that was making me so attracted to him and so breathless when he came close, and to think that all of these started when he decided to join the army? You know, the day my brother Samuel went for the army seemed unreal, like if it didn't fit into their everyday, predictable life. He was simply a lanky, silent youngster back then, with spectacles that often appeared to slip down his nose and a slouchy posture as if he was trying to vanish inside himself. No one saw it coming, not our parents, not me, and certainly not Samuel himself until he made the decision. It was a warm summer afternoon when he announced it to the family. We were sitting around the small wooden dining table, a spot that had hosted more casual meals and laughter than serious conversations. His father had raised an eyebrow, his mother froze mid-bite, and Grace nearly choked on her drink. "You joined the army," I blurted out, staring at Samuel like he'd just told me he was moving to Mars. He nodded, his face set with determination, but his hands betrayed him, fidgeting in his lap. "Yay. I leave next week." Dad chuckled, probably trying. "You in the army, son. They'll snap you like a twig." I couldn't help laughing too, but it came out sharp, tinged with disbelief. "Are you serious? Danny? You can't even run a mile without gasping for air." But he didn't back. "Oos," he said, his voice firmer than I'd ever heard it. "I want to do something with my life. Prove to everyone, prove to myself that I can be more than." He trailed off, staring at the table as if the words he needed were written there. I knew what he meant. More than the nerdy kid, more than the one everyone underestimated. A week later, he was gone. Just like that, life went on, or at least it was supposed to, but his absence left a gap, this gaping hole in our family that nothing could fill. At first we heard from him now, and then a letter here, a phone call there. He didn't give many details about what he was doing, but he sounded happy, confident. Even I clung to those rare updates, tucking his letters into a little box I kept under my bed. But what happened next caught me completely by surprise. After a while the letters stopped, the phone calls stopped, and as I sat wondering all these, I kept asking myself, why? What happened? Did he die in battle? If I'm being honest, I missed him more than I let myself admit, but life moved forward as it always does. I had a life of my own now, but every now and then, a memory of Samuel would sneak up on me. I'd see a young soldier on TV and feel a lump in my throat, or I'd hear a laugh that sounded just like his. We never stopped talking about him completely, but as time went on, it happened less and less. He became a distant memory, a chapter. We closed because keeping it open hurt too much. But for me, it never really closed. Not all the way. I had accepted the worst and moved on, even started dating again, and I fell in love with this guy, Tom. He made me feel what I hadn't felt in a long time, and it helped that he was handsome too. To anyone looking at us from the outside, we were in an amazing relationship. He was the boyfriend other girls will kill to have. But the truth was far messier. I wasn't really happy. I don't know why. Maybe it's because I missed my brother Samuel, or everything just reminded me of him too much. Maybe I felt pain at the thought of him, and I was angry at him for leaving. Thinking about him now felt like reopening a wound I thought had healed. I often wondered where he was, if he was even alive. I'd picture him as he was the last time I saw him, skinny, awkward, and full of dreams. Sometimes, though, my imagination took darker turns, conjuring images of him as someone unrecognizable, a hardened soldier, a stranger. If only I knew. My imagination was not so far off. But when it came to my parents, Samuel began to fade in their memories. At least that's what I thought until the unimaginable happened 2 days later, the day we weren't sure was going to come at all. The day Samuel came home, it was late Saturday afternoon. I was in the kitchen stirring soup for dinner while Max played on the living floor. Tom was out running errands that, as usual, seemed to take far longer than they should. When the doorbell rang, I barely gave it a thought, expecting a delivery or a neighbor stopping by. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and opened the door. What I saw froze me in place, standing. There was a man I didn't recognize. At first he was tall, broad-shouldered, and radiated a quiet confidence that was almost intimidating. His hair was shorter, his face sharper and older than I remembered. But his eyes hadn't changed. Danny. I whispered my voice, barely audible. He smiled, the corners of his lips lifting in that same crooked way. I remembered so well. Hey, Em. For a moment, I just stared, my mind struggling to catch up with my eyes. Then, before I could stop myself, I threw my arms around his neck. He hugged me back, strong and steady, and I felt a sob rise in my throat. You're alive, I choked out, pulling back to look at him. Tears blurred my vision, but I didn't care. You're alive. I told you I was tough, he said with a laugh, the sound so familiar. It made my chest ache. I dragged him inside, calling for Max. My son appeared, clutching a toy truck, his wide eyes fixed on Samuel. This is your Uncle Danny, I said, my voice trembling, the one I told you about. Max studied him with a seriousness only a 4-year-old could muster. Then he grinned. You're big, he said. Samuel laughed again. Yeah, I guess I grew up a bit, he said, ruffling Max's hair. I called my parents immediately. Within an hour they were at my house. My mother sobbed uncontrollably as she hugged Samuel, and even my father, always so reserved, pulled him into an emotional embrace. The living room buzzed with conversation as questions flew at Sam. Where'd he been? Why hadn't he written Samuel long stretches? Without communication and an injury, not life-threatening, but enough to complicate everything. By the time he'd recovered, he said he wasn't sure how to come back. I was wrong, he admitted quietly. I should have come back sooner. As the night wore on, I couldn't stop glancing at him. He was different, confident, magnetic. And yet there were glimpses of the Samuel I used to know. But something about him made my heart race in ways I couldn't explain. Something felt complicated. This is where the story begins to get a bit weird. But bear with me, you see. I couldn't deny it anymore. My brother was no longer the skinny, awkward boy I remembered. He was tall, strong, and undeniably attractive. I hated myself for noticing, but the way my pulse quickened whenever he stood too close or brushed past me in the hallway. I tried to push the thoughts away, bury them deep where they couldn't hurt anyone, but the harder I tried, the more they surfaced, refusing to be ignored. One evening after Max had gone to bed and Tom was still at work, Samuel and I sat in the living room sharing a bottle of wine. At first the conversation was light, reminiscing about our childhood, laughing over old family stories, but then it shifted. You've changed, I said, my voice softening. As I studied him, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes meeting mine. 8 years will do that to a person. No, I mean it's more than that, I replied, hesitant. You're different, confident, strong. It's like you're a completely new person. A small, teasing smile tugged at his lips. Is that a compliment? I laughed nervously, the sound awkward to my own ears. I guess it is for a moment. Neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, heavy and charged, and I felt my face flush under his gaze. You've changed too, he said. Finally, his voice lower, more serious. My breath hitched. How you're, I don't know, more beautiful than The words hung in the air, and my heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I opened my mouth to respond, to say something, anything, but no words came. Samuel's eyes lingered on mine for a moment longer before he stood, breaking the spell. I should probably get some sleep, he said. His voice steady, though something unreadable flickered in his expression. Yeah, I said quickly, my voice barely above a whisper. Good night, as he walked away. I felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. I sank into the couch, my thoughts a tangled mess. It was wrong. I knew it was wrong. But no matter how hard I tried to fight it, the feelings wouldn't go away. That night, as I lay in bed next to my sleeping boyfriend, I couldn't stop thinking about Samuel, about the way he looked at me, the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years, and deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The tension between Samuel and me grew the following day. It was subtle at first, woven into fleeting glances, stolen moments, and conversations that seemed to dance around unspoken feelings. I told myself it was nothing, just a passing phase born out of the excitement of his return. But deep down, I knew it was more. I was more right than I thought, because no one was prepared for what happened later on. A few days after it had been a week after Samuel's return, the family had gathered for dinner. Tom was in a surprisingly good mood, cracking jokes and entertaining Avione, while Samuel shared stories from his time in the army. I tried to focus on the conversation, but I found myself distracted by the way. Samuel's deep voice filled the room, the way his shirt stretched across his broad shoulders, the way when dinner I retreated. Tom had already fallen asleep on the couch downstairs, the TV casting a soft glow over his face. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to quiet the storm of emotions swirling inside me. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the soft hum of the refrigerator. I turned onto my side, willing myself to sleep, but the restlessness wouldn't leave me. Then I heard a faint knock at my door. My heart jumped for a moment. I thought I had imagined it, but then it came again louder. This time Grace Samuel's voice was quiet, barely more than a whisper. I sat up, my pulse racing. "Come in," I said, my voice shaky. The door opened and Samuel stepped inside. He was dressed casually in a t-shirt and sweatpants, but the sight of him standing there in the dim light made my breath catch. "I couldn't sleep," he said, closing the door behind him. I nodded, unsure of what to say. "Me neither." For a moment he just stood there, his hands in his pockets, his eyes locked. The air between us felt heavy, charged with an electricity. "Neither of us." "I've been thinking," he said, finally, his voice low. "About Samuel." I began, my voice trembling, but before I could finish, he was in front of me, his hands on my shoulders, his face inch from mine. "I know," he said softly. "I know it's wrong, but I can't stop. World seemed to stop. I knew I should remind him and myself that this was a line we couldn't cross, aching at the sincerity in his eyes. "Don't," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Don't apologize. It wasn't just you." I stopped myself, unsure of how to finish the sentence. His expression. "Did I want to make your life harder?" "Am," he said, "but I can't pretend I don't feel what I feel." My breath hitched, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "This is incorrect. Danny, we both know what it is." I know he said it gently, but that doesn't alter how I feel. I looked away, my emotions warring within me. The guilt was almost unbearable. Guilt for betraying Tom, for betraying the family bond I shared with Samuel. But beneath the guilt, there was something else. Something I was afraid to name. And then he did it again. As we sat there, the tension between us thick enough to cut, Samuel reached out and took my hand in his. His touch was warm, grounding, and despite everything, I didn't pull away. "I'll leave if that's what you want," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If having me here makes it harder for you, I'll go." The thought of him leaving sent a pang through my chest, and I realized with startling clarity that I didn't want, but I also didn't know how to navigate the feelings consuming me. "I don't know what," I admitted, my voice trembling. Samuel didn't push me. Instead, he gave my hand a gentle squeeze before letting go. "Just know I'm here," he said. "Whatever happens, I'm here." As he stood and walked back into the house, I sat alone in the dark, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. I had no idea where this path would lead, but I knew one thing for certain. Nothing in my life would ever be the same again. As days went by, the tension between Samuel and me became impossible to ignore. It seeped into every interaction, every glance, every shared moment. I felt as though I were living two lives, one where I was a girlfriend and a sister, and another where I was consumed by the forbidden connection I shared with Samuel. And this is where it gets tricky. At first, I tried to fight it. I threw myself into my relationship, attempting to reignite the spark with Tom. I planned family outings, cooked elaborate meals, and even tried to initiate moments of intimacy. But Tom was his attention divided. "But do you even care anymore?" I finally snapped one evening after another half-hearted conversation over dinner. Tom barely looked up. "What are you talking about, you?" I said, my voice rising. "Me. United States. This marriage. Do you even notice what's happening between us?" Tom sighed, pushing his plate away. "I'm tired, Grace. Can we not?" My frustration boiled over and I stormed out of the room, slamming the door. Tears stung my refused to let them fall. The faint creak of the floorboards outside, my heart skipped a beat. The door opened, his expression and something doing any more. Samuel crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, His presence was calming, and yet it sent my pulse racing. "You don't have to do it alone," he said. I looked at him, my emotions bubbling to the surface. "It's not just Tom," I said. "It's everything you being here, the way I feel. I don't know how to handle it." Samuel reached for my hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "You don't have to handle it," he said. "Not right now. Just let yourself feel what you feel," and the fire ignited. I searched his face, my defenses crumbling. Before I could stop myself, I leaned in, our lips, meeting in a kiss that was both tender and desperate. That night we crossed the line again, and this time there was no denying what we had become to each other. We would be lying if we said we felt platonic towards each other. What I felt for Samuel, I wasn't sure I have ever felt that way about even Tom. It felt real, too real, exciting and intriguing. I just couldn't get enough, and neither could he. On top of all that, it felt good that we were a secret. It made it so exciting. It was so wrong that it felt right, but I was stupid not to realize this would only create a chain reaction. When the secrecy of our affair began to weigh on me, I felt like a stranger in my own home, constantly looking over my shoulder, afraid Tom would notice the change in me. But Tom remained oblivious. His focus elsewhere, as always, if he noticed the lingering look, the subtle touches, or the way I seemed more distracted than usual. He didn't say anything. The guilt was suffocating. I loved Max, and I knew the risk I was taking could destroy but every time I tried to distance, I found myself drawn back to him like a moth. Why was he so hard to resist? He's my brother, for crying out loud. We never really got the chance to talk about what was going on between us. But soon enough, an opportunity presented itself, and I took it. One afternoon when Max was at school and Tom was at work, Samuel and I found ourselves alone in the house. We were sitting in the living room, the silence between us heavy, thick with everything we hadn't said yet. I could feel the tension in the air, and I knew this couldn't go on. Finally, I broke the silence. "This can't go on." He turned to look at me, his face unreadable, but his eyes, there was something in them. "Do you really want it to end?" I opened my mouth ready to speak, but the words wouldn't. I didn't know what I wanted. I was standing on the edge of something, caught between the life I had and the pull of something I couldn't explain. I was torn between the family I had built with Tom and the feelings I had for Samuel. Feelings that were far too complicated to understand, let alone admit. "I don't know," I said. Finally, the words feeling hollow as they left my lips. Samuel's hand brushed mine gently, sending a shiver down my spine. "To decide," he said, "but whatever happens, I'm not going anywhere. I'm here for days." His words should have brought me comfort, should have they only made everything harder. The reality of what I was doing, of what we were doing, settled like a stone in. I couldn't deny it anymore. I couldn't ignore the way the life I had, the life I'd built with Tom, was slipping. As the days passed, everything started to unravel. Cracks in my carefully constructed world were widening, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. I tried to hold it together, but the weight of my secret was suffocating me. Tom, usually so oblivious, had started to notice. He wasn't the sharpest when it came to picking up on things, but lately he'd been seeing the distance between us. He'd noticed the way I flinched when he touched me, the way my eyes seemed to wander. When Samuel was in the room, he'd seen it all, the little signs that something was off, and I couldn't hide it anymore. Then came the evening after I'd put Max to bed. Tom came into the kitchen while I was cleaning up. His movements deliberate, as though he was preparing for something. There was something in his posture and the way his jaw was clenched that immediately made my stomach churn. "Grace, we need to talk," he said, his voice calm but firm. I froze. My heart was pounding in my chest. "What about?" I asked, though I already knew. He leaned against the counter, his arms crossed tightly. "About you. About Samuel." I could feel the blood drain from my face. I couldn't breathe, couldn't find the words to explain myself. My mind raced, spinning out of control, but I couldn't figure out what to say. "What do you mean?" I asked. But my voice didn't sound like my own. It was tight, strained. "You've been different since he came back." Tom said, his voice quieter now, the accusation still heavy between us. "Distant. Secretive, and don't think I haven't noticed how close you two have gotten." I opened my mouth to deny it, to dismiss his suspicions, but the words got stuck in my throat. I couldn't deny it, not anymore. The truth was already written in the way I looked at Samuel and the way my heart beat faster when he was near. I couldn't escape it. Grace, Tom said, his voice dropping lower, becoming dangerous. Is there something you need to tell me? Panic rushed through me and I shook my head, desperate to make it stop. No, of course not. You're imagining things. I said, my voice cracking, but the words felt hollow even as I said them. Tom didn't believe me. I could see it in his eyes. But before I could do anything else, the sound of the back door or opening interrupted us. Samuel stepped into the kitchen, his expression immediately hardening. When he saw the tension in the room, his eyes flicked between Tom with awareness. What's going on? He asked, his voice steady but sharp, his eyes narrowing. Why don't you tell me? Samuel, you've been cozying up to my girlfriend since the moment you got here. What exactly is going on between you? I felt my stomach drop to the floor. This was it. The worst had finally. Tom, stop, pleaded, my voice cracking with the weight of it. Tom didn't listen. He stepped toward Samuel. His fists clenched, his anger erupting. You think you can just waltz back into her life after 8 years and do whatever you want? She told me all about it, how it hurt her. When you stopped sending letters, you hurt my girlfriend. I could feel the tension in the air like a live wire, and I was frozen, trapped between them. I wanted to stop this, to make it all go away, but there was nothing I could do. Tom and Samuel were too far gone now, but Samuel didn't back down. His jaw clenched, but his voice stayed calm even as the storm in the room raged on. I'm not trying to take anything from you, Tom, he said, his voice firm, but maybe if you treated her the way she deserves to be treated, we wouldn't be here right now. The words hung in the air, and I could feel the weight of them pressing down on me. I knew what Samuel meant. I knew what he was saying, and it hurt because I knew that there was truth in it. Tom's face twisted with fury, and before I could stop it, he lunged at Samuel. The two men collided, their bodies slamming together with a force that made the air crackle. I screamed, trying to pull them apart, but they were too strong, too caught up in their rage to listen. Stop it, both of you, stop! My voice desperate, but they didn't stop. The sound of fists hitting flesh filled the room, and all I could do was watch, helpless. Finally, Samuel, as he stood, Tom. He spat, his voice low and venomous. Fine, I love her, and whether you want to admit it or not, she deserves better than what you've been giving her. The words hit me like a physical blow, and for a moment, everything stopped. My breath caught in my throat, and the room seemed to spin around me. Tom turned to me, his eyes wide with shock and hurt. Is that true? He asked, his voice raw. Do you love him? I couldn't answer. My throat tightened and tears welled up in my eyes. The weight of it all, the betrayal, the lies, the truth crushed me. I wanted to say something to make it all right, but the words wouldn't come. I couldn't bring myself to say anything. I couldn't bring myself to hurt him anymore. Grace, Tom said again, his voice cracking with emotion. Tell me the truth. But there was no easy answer. There is no way to remedy this. The truth had been revealed, and there was no way to hide it. There was no escape the devastation I had created. As I stood there, trapped between the two men I had cared about, the reality struck me harder than I could have imagined. I could not go back. I couldn't change what had happened. All I could do was face the repercussions of what I'd let to happen. The weight of the truth suffocated me, and I understood there was no way out. I had ruined everything, and now I was forced to deal with the consequences.